How Britain saved Canada from becoming American. When the United States won its independence, Britain didn't lose North America. It just drew a line higher up the map. For the next century, that line nearly vanished more than once. From secret treaties and invasions to bribes and full-scale wars, America tried again and again to pull Canada under its flag. The American Revolution didn't end with freedom. It ended with obsession. When Britain finally surrendered in 1783, the new United States didn't see peace. It saw unfinished business. The British held the northern colonies, and for men like Benjamin Franklin, that was unacceptable. Franklin called it a natural right for the continent to be united under liberty. In private letters, George Washington went even further, describing Canada as the 14th colony that awaits rescue. It wasn't enough to beat the empire. The founding fathers wanted to erase it from North America. Their chance came early. In 1775, barely a year into the Revolution, American troops marched north in the invasion of Quebec. They thought Canada would join their rebellion against the crown. Instead, they were greeted by snow, disease, and British cannons. General Richard Montgomery led the charge through icy streets toward Quebec City, but on December 31st, 1775, he was shot and killed. His troops panicked and retreated into the storm. That single bullet ended the first U.S. attempt to annex Canada. Washington's dream of a continental republic died in the snow that winter, at least for the moment, but old ambitions die hard. 3 decades later, the United States came back for a second round. On June 18, 1812, President James Madison signed a declaration of war against Britain. Officially, it was about trade restrictions and impressment of sailors. Unofficially, it was about conquest. The Congressional War Hawks, led by men like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, promised that invading Canada would be a matter of marching. Madison's secret memo to his cabinet described the Canadian colonies as ripe fruit ready to fall. Washington expected to liberate them and claim them. The first American attacks launched through Detroit, Niagara, and Montreal, with troops confident they'd be welcomed as heroes. But instead of crowds, they met gunfire. Local militias and indigenous allies defended their towns fiercely. At Detroit, British General Isaac Brock, working alongside Tecumseh's Confederacy, surrounded the American fort with just a few hundred men and a brilliant bluff. Brock's forces lit extra campfires and shouted in multiple languages to sound larger. The psychological trick worked. General William Hull surrendered his entire army on August 16, 1812, without firing a single shot. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in U.S. military history. At Queenston Heights, near Niagara, the Americans tried again, crossing the river under heavy fire. The battle turned into chaos, but Brock's leadership rallied his men before he was killed mid-charge. His death turned him into a Canadian legend, the face of defiance against American expansion. By the end of 1812, Washington's plan for a quick victory had collapsed. Still, the war raged on for 3 more brutal years. Many historians argue that if it had lasted just 6 more months, before Britain's reinforcements returned from Europe after Napoleon's fall, Canada might have been overrun, but timing saved the North, and the Empire's focus shifted back across the Atlantic just in time to rescue its colony. What the Americans didn't know was that Britain had a secret weapon, and it didn't wear red coats. Tecumseh, the Shawnee war chief, had spent years building a multi-tribal alliance across the Great Lakes to resist U.S. expansion. His vision was extraordinary for its time, a unified indigenous nation defending its land from both settlers and soldiers. When war broke out, Britain saw the opportunity and armed his confederacy. It became the first true proxy army in North American history. Tecumseh's alliance was feared across the frontier. His reputation alone made soldiers surrender. His victory at Detroit wasn't just a tactical win, it was psychological domination, but it came with a cost. Britain's promises of lasting support vanished as soon as the war turned in their favor. On October 5th, 1813, at the Battle of the Thames in Ontario, Tecumseh was killed leading his forces against General William Henry Harrison. With his death, his confederacy collapsed. Within a year, Britain signed peace and left his people behind. Modern historians call it the first great sacrifice for Canada's survival. The Indigenous Alliance had saved the colony, only to be erased from the reward. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, is often described as a simple peace deal, but the original draft was anything but simple. Buried inside early negotiation notes was a clause proposing a mutual continental defense and trade pact, a framework that would have bound Britain, Canada, and the United States into into one cooperative bloc. It was an audacious idea for the early 19th century. Shared ports, unified tariffs, and an alliance where war between them would become legally impossible. The proposal came from the British side, led by Henry Goulburn and Admiral Lord Gambier, both of whom saw the 1812 conflict as proof that endless border wars were bad business. Goulburn later wrote in his personal papers that the idea marked the closest we came to continental unity. The Americans didn't see it that way. To them, this mutual defense pact sounded like empire rebranded. Senator William Branch Giles called it a polite form of recolonization. The United States had just fought 2 wars to get rid of British influence. They weren't about to sign up for a shared military command or currency. The American delegation, led by John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, tore the clause out of the draft and demanded a clean treaty. No alliances, no economic ties, no acknowledgement of British supremacy. Adams called the British proposal poison-wrapped diplomacy. If that early draft had survived, the 3 nations might have created what economists a century later would call the missed North American Union of the 19th century. Trade economists in the 1930s reviewing Ghent's archives described how the pact would have created one of the largest economic zones in history. Atlantic ports from Halifax to Charleston connected under joint naval protection. Instead, both sides settled for what became the status quo. The old borders, no reparations, no alliance. The war ended, but the continent remained divided. By choice, not by accident. After the peace, London learned its lesson. Diplomacy hadn't secured Canada. Walls would. Starting in the 1820s, Britain began transforming its North American colonies into what military planners called the Northern Defense System. The first phase was fortification. Kingston, Ontario became a garrison town with the Fort Henry complex, capable of housing hundreds of redcoats. Quebec City, already fortified since the French era, got massive stone upgrades between 1820 and 1832, turning it into an artillery hub guarding the St. Lawrence. The crown jewel, however, was Halifax, refitted by the Royal Navy into what British sailors called the Gibraltar of the West. Its docks could shelter entire fleets, and its coastal batteries overlooked the North Atlantic routes the Americans needed for trade. To connect these fortresses inland, engineers built the Rideau Canal between 1826 and 1832, linking Ottawa to Kingston. On paper, it was for shipping and trade, but in reality, it was a backup route for moving troops and supplies safely away from the vulnerable St. Lawrence River, a secret military highway in case of another US invasion. Behind the scenes, Britain built something even more invisible: intelligence. From the 1830s to the 1860s, British agents quietly operated in New York, Vermont, and Maine, reporting to the governor of Lower Canada. They intercepted letters, tracked American Army recruitment, and bribed local merchants for information. When US militias in 1837 considered another strike into Upper Canada during the rebellions, British command already knew their plans weeks in advance. The same network foiled 2 smaller invasion plots between 1857 and 1866. The Americans never discovered how every move was anticipated. They never realized Canada had become one of the most heavily monitored borders in the Western Hemisphere. Barely a year later, a new threat came from a strange source: Irish revolutionaries living in America. Between 1866 and 1871, Irish-American militias known as the Fenians launched a series of border attacks into Canada. The plan was bizarre but real: seize parts of Ontario and New Brunswick, then trade the captured territory to Britain in exchange for Ireland's independence. The first major raid struck from Buffalo, New York on June 1st, 1866, when Brigadier John O'Neill led 800 armed veterans of the US Civil War into Fort Erie, Ontario. They defeated a small Canadian militia at Ridgeway, but by the next day, British regulars arrived and the invaders retreated across the Niagara River under fire. More raids followed from Vermont and Maine, but everyone failed. What they did succeed in doing was terrifying the colonies. Recruitment for the Canadian militia surged almost overnight, from a few thousand volunteers to over 40,000. By 1871, Britain flooded the colonies with rifles and artillery to prevent a repeat. The raids, meant to weaken Britain, did the opposite. They pushed Canadians to demand a professional defense and solidified the argument for full independence within the empire. Meanwhile, the United States kept looking north, still obsessed with finishing the map. The political slogan of the 19th century, Manifest Destiny drove US expansion from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Canada was the last blank space. Britain knew it and blocked every attempt through diplomacy. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 split the Pacific Northwest along the 49th parallel, forcing America to stop just short of Vancouver. 2 decades later, the Alaska Purchase, 1867, boxed in Canada's western coast, a move the British turned to their advantage by using Alaska's position as a naval buffer against American ships. Even the Crown itself got involved. Queen Victoria, aware of rising US pressure to integrate Canadian trade, personally vetoed economic proposals that would have merged Canadian customs with US ports. One 1869 memorandum from the Colonial Office records her note in the margin. This would make the Dominion an appendage, not an ally. The Empire's strategy was simple: keep Canada close, but separate enough to survive American gravity. By the time Washington realized the border had hardened, it was too late. The forts were built, the canals were secure, and the Confederation flag was flying. Britain hadn't just defended a colony, and it had engineered an entire geography of resistance. Every river, port, and province became part of a system designed to stop the United States from completing its continental dream.